Jeff, I want to speak a little bit about moral decision-making and especially the role of the Scriptures in this matter. I think you're teaching some material on moral theology, are you not, at the moment?
I am. Lourdes College is a wonderful school, but we're a small school, and so that means theologically you do lots. My area is really historical theology, but I do the ethics courses and some of the doctrinal courses as well.
Well, I'm out of my field, as you know, also, being a systematic theologian, and the area of morality is not mine of expertise, but that does not preclude us talking about it.
That's right.
And seeing whatever insights we can draw from the people who are professional moral theologians. And so I want to talk about decision-making, and when we talk about moral decision-making, I mean, all kind of things come to mind, don't they? We got to make decisions about our relationships, about married life. We got decisions about our own spiritual growth. There's a sort of personal element in it. There's a social ethics. We have to try to figure out what to do about the housing problem. There's a larger social ethics that has to do with the relationship between nations. Questions of peace and war, for example. And so we got a broad range that when we talk about moral decision-making, we're talking about something we're doing constantly, making ethical decisions about some minor matters and some of greater weight.
I'm afraid sometimes I make my students crazy because as the course progresses, I try to point out that in the course of your day, you make hundreds of ethical decisions. You know, are you going to use a styrofoam cup?
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to insist that you have some kind of porcelain cup? Are you going to eat in this restaurant where you're going to mess with your cholesterol? Are you going to go have some chicken someplace or a salad?
Are you going to light up a cigarette or not?
Exactly. You know, so all day long we make ethical decisions. We tend not to think about them. And in a sense, that's what a course is helpful for, to step back and reflect on that stuff. It's what they used to call remote preparation for things as opposed to more proximate preparation, so that you have some background to work out of. But then there are crucial questions that appear and loom large, and I think that's really what you're alluding to today that we want to talk about.
Yes, well, one of those, obviously, is the situation in the Persian Gulf, and I want to use it more as an example rather than probing the content of how we answer it. But if you look at the situation in the Persian Gulf, like other great crises, I mean, it's filled with complexity. There's all kind of difficult moral decisions, and what you find, interestingly enough, is Christians on both sides of most of the questions that it involves. There were Christians who said it was we should go to war to ward off the threat of Saddam Hussein, and there were Christians who drew on their tradition to say, well, we should not, that such a war would be unjust. And then once the war started, we had people saying, well, for the overall theory of the just war says we really should prosecute this war vigorously and get into a land war and end it quickly. Other people said, no, we could avoid casualties if we just wait and try to interdict their supplies and so on. So at every step of the way, you see a lot of diversity of opinion, even among Christians who are supposedly formed by the Scriptures. And that's what I'm really after here, Jeff, is to talk a little bit about the role of the Scriptures in our moral decision-making. And I guess my first point is to sense the limitation of all that. You can go back and read your Bible all day long and look carefully at the teaching of the Gospels and not get a clear answer to some of the complexity that we have to deal with in the Persian Gulf. Now, I mean, some people will say they do get a clear answer, and maybe at times they do. But I think even if we move beyond that example, and you say, well, what are we supposed to do about the housing situation in the United States right now? Do you find a clear answer in the Bible for that? Maybe there you'd say, well, I really don't. I mean, we should help homeless people, but how do you do that? What public policy would be best? It highlights, I think, whenever you look at complex moral issues, you begin to see something, I think, of the limitations of the Scriptures in helping us answer it.
Precisely. The thing that always comes up in class are biomedical questions, you know. Heart transplants. There just isn't anything there.
Jesus didn't talk about that question, did he? He didn't
clearly
talk about in vitro fertilization either.
Obviously. And what I think we can do is maybe approach the Scriptures from a couple of directions. One more broad, as kind of a background or a context in which we do our moral reasoning. And in fact, when we make our decisions, it's moral reasoning. And in a sense, it's moral philosophy that we do in the context of faith. I think is perhaps a more honest way to talk about what moral theology is. The Scriptures give us a background, and then there are specific injunctions in the Scriptures which can be helpful to point to values. So both of those things have to go on. We have to have a broad context that we operate in, and then we can also find some directives, individual specific things that can be helpful when we have to make a decision.
That's a good framework. Let's use it to guide our discussion here. You're good at that, Jeff. I appreciate it. What about looking at this broad perspective kind of question? You know, I'll just offer one first of all, and that is that in looking at these questions, we have to say that in one way or another, our faith has to guide our fundamental attitudes towards it and set the framework for the moral decision making, not some other thing, not, for example, psychology or sociology or the national civil religion that is operative in the United States. I mean, my summary phrase for that I like to use a lot is that the cross must be judge of the flag. That for a Christian, the gospel sets the largest framework, the overarching perspective, and not the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, as fine a documents as they might be.
Today, with the question of the Persian Gulf in mind, there are people that I know who want to hear what the gospel has to say, but they say we have to be more practical than that, and they kind of put that aside as they make their moral decisions and say that we have to be, and that's the American way to do things. You know, we're very
it's pragmatic.
Pragmatic, that's the word I was looking for. And so I like that religion stuff, but it's not practical enough. I have to kind of put it to the side now while I do this other thing. And I think you're absolutely right. We have to integrate that stuff, and our faith has to stand at the heart of it. And if our faith isn't practical, then it's not worthwhile.
I know. It's such a hard objection. I remember when the Bishop's Peace Pastoral came out giving lectures on that and, you know, claiming that it sets some framework for making moral decisions about peace and war questions, armament race, etc. And I remember people listening to that and saying, well, that's nice theory, you know, great, but practically you got to defend the country. You know, practically, you got to have more weapons. Practically, we got to have this nuclear capability and so on. And so there really was, at the theoretical level, a divorce of the Christian principles from the given ethical question. And I think that's one thing we would have to fight against.
I think one of the important things that the Scriptures can contribute here, and I'm back to that context, that broader idea, is that they give us a story that forms the furniture in our minds, if you will. And I think that in many ways we've lost that biblical story as a context. That's not to say that in days gone by when people understood those categories in more literal sorts of ways, you know, Adam and Eve are the man and the woman in the garden, there weren't problems with that. But there at least was a commonality that we could all share in terms of a mindset. My own kids, I'm constantly trying to find good stories for them that have good moral lessons in them, because they enter into the story and make a choice based on what they sort of empathize with the people in the story. And this is certainly what Jesus does with the parables, the story of the Good Samaritan, or who is my neighbor. And Jesus, instead of, which is a common problem with teachers, we want to give the answer, say, no, we got to make the student work. Jesus is a wonderful teacher. He says, let me tell you a story, and goes through the story, and in the end says, now who do you think the neighbor was? And precisely and at that point you've got to say the Samaritan was. You've been sucked in, and your value system has been tampered with in a very positive kind of way. So the Scriptures, I think, can give us a story, the furniture in our minds and our hearts, kind of a vision that we bring to our world, which is going to be very different than a transactional sort of, well, we have to do this so that we can get that.
You pointed out a problem with all that, Jeff, I think, and that is that the point that the story is not operative. The large biblical story no longer sets the framework for our culture. In the medieval world, everyone thought in those categories, and we're at ease with that. But yet in the dominant culture in the United States, that's no longer the case. The dominant wisdom or philosophy is a secular kind of story for the most part, I think. And it's the trend is set by the major newspapers, for example, or the major news periodicals, or the opinion makers in the country. And it really isn't so much the biblical story. It's more a story of Americanism. It's the civil religion story is what I think is dominant very often in people's minds. That's what creates the problem. I think you begin to say, well, the flag does become then judge of the cross. The flag sets the dominant thought framework framework. Whoever sets the framework, has a control over how it turns out. And Christians no longer set that. I think that's true to say in our culture. You might take individuals who have maintained the notion you brought out, where the Bible really does create the framework, or it's a biblical story that guides their thought patterns. I often have a different sense when I've preached in black churches, for example. One senses that there, the biblical stories are still the dominant framework. Now, I could be wrong about that, but that's my sense of it. It's the reason Jesse Jackson could go into black churches during a political campaign and have an immediate resonance. In other words, he knows the language, he knows the stories, he knows the symbols that they are already comfortable with. I find myself preaching in a black church very differently. You can assume some commonality here. And that's what you try to build on. Whereas I think in the dominant white culture, the dominant culture as a whole in the United States, you're right in saying there's some other story that dominates it, or maybe a lot of other stories. But it's not necessarily the biblical one.
Something you mentioned triggered another problem, I think, that exists, and that is that even in the Middle Ages, where the biblical story formed a framework for thought, as we look back at the way the Middle Ages looked at the Bible, they had largely translated Jewish and then Jewish-Gentile categories into medieval Christian categories. And every age really has to do that. But you have to know that you're doing it. And there needs to be an attempt to get back to what the text meant originally, to find out what those stories were really about. And in a sense, now I'm moving to a second sort of use of the Scriptures here. If we're talking about the story first as a context, if we're going to claim that in the story there are specific moral things,
directives and so on.
Yeah,
Before
norms.
you get into that, Jeff, let's just make sure we've got a hold of this story notion again, because I think it's very important in decision making. I think you're right. Story is what works for us psychologically. Your example of your children, I think, is a very telling one. Very often it's the stories that capture the insight, and the stories touch us in a way that is beyond the merely rational. They touch our emotions and our imaginations. We remember them.
The crucial item, I think.
Yeah, right. This is a book that Philip Keene wrote on morality. I forget the exact title of it. And I wish I could think of it now. But anyway, his whole point was Christian morality connected with imagination. And that if you can touch the imagination, shape the imagination, then you begin to dictate what responses people make to particular moral questions. So if you've really sort of drunk in the large biblical story of a God who loves all people, who is tolerance for people, who's a loving, merciful judge, who doesn't discriminate among people, well, you begin to sense yourself saying, I can't stereotype, or I'm not allowed to be prejudiced against other groups. I have to be inclusive in my language and in my thought. In other words, there's a large biblical story that is inclusive in a sense. I realize there's another biblical story that's very exclusive. That creates a problem. But the larger sweep of the Scriptures tells us of a loving God who's in tune with everybody. You get that into your imagination. That becomes structures the way you view the world. Then when you see a joke being told against Arab Americans or discriminatory practices against Jewish people or something, or against black people, then you notice it. It's jarring. It's out of sync with the way your imagination is structured.
Exactly. There's something inside that says there's a difficulty. And as your imagination, as you were saying, and I want to agree, is the crucial item here. Roman Catholics love philosophy so much, we've tended to do moral theology in a highly philosophical key, so that we would use syllogistic logic to work out the answer to individual questions. But I think a lot of people have had the experience of logically working something out, but something still bothers them, and it's an affective sort of thing. It's a connection precisely with that imagination, so that when somebody tells the joke or the story and it bothers you, you might not be able to logically work that out, but something says this isn't right, and I can't put my finger on it in terms of language yet. If I play around for a while, maybe I can. but it's precisely getting to that imagination and forming those structures there.
And I think what we would hope as Christians is that the story of Jesus becomes one's dominant story, that it's the whole story of his life and his death and his resurrection, of all the miracles and the parables, that begins to set the way we look at the world. That's what we say in Christian terms, let's put on the mind of Christ. That's Paul's injunction to us. Put on the mind of Christ. And one way one does that is by knowing the stories, knowing how Jesus has interacted in given situations. So when we see him being sensitive with the woman at the well, for example, and yet a firmness and a sensitivity beautifully combined, I think, an insight on the part of Jesus. Maybe we say, well, I would like to deal with people like that. I'd like to confront people who bug me with that sort of firm sensitivity that Jesus demonstrated in that story and in other ones. So that begins to structure me or to guide me in how I would go about it. It seems to me that one of the things we'd say about making good moral decisions is let's let the story of Jesus and insight into that story guide my moral decisions.
I like the direction you take with that. Early in the century, there was within Protestantism an ethical question: what would Jesus do? And then that's what I should do. That's not the right moral question. The question is, what should I do? And I use Jesus as this first century Jewish man as a guide for me, and his story to inform and to inspire my action. But the action that I do is uniquely mine. I'm not going to act the same way that Jesus would, because I'm not Jesus, I'm me.
Right, and we also live in a different environment, a different culture, different
Absolutely.
social milieu, and one has to, to imitate Christ doesn't mean you walk around with sandals.
Exactly.
Or
exactly.
wash your feet before you go into a party. There's something different about it, and that's why the transfer is not all that simple. But the transfer, on the other hand, I think, as you pointed out, is often unconscious or preconscious. It's not a rational process. It's not asking exactly what would Jesus do in this situation. It's knowing the stories of Jesus, being immersed in the scriptural tales, having put on the mind of Christ, and then sort of spontaneously or automatically making good decisions in a given situation. Very often I think that it happens with simple people who don't know anything about moral theology. They don't know about, they don't sit down and add up pluses and minuses. There's an intuition about it. I often say that, for good people, their intuition is one of their greatest guides to moral decision making, especially if that intuition is somehow formed by the story of Jesus, the example of Jesus.
Isn't this Karl Rahner insisting on orthopraxis, that yes. A lot of people aren't orthodox. They can't come up and say all the theological things, but yet their hearts have been so formed that it comes out of them in their actions.
Right. If somebody wants them to cheat, they say, well, I can't do that.
Because and they'll say just wrong.
Yeah.
They don't have a big rational argument for it. They'll say
right.
it just isn't right. I can't do it.
It isn't right. And sometimes I think all of us feel that. And that's when our conscience bothers us, when we're out of sync with our intuition, out of sync with the fundamental story that we know we should be living out. And it bothers us to say, I'm off track here. I'm not living correctly. I've betrayed what we call the fundamental option, the direction moving towards God.
And that's a wonderfully healthy thing. I guess I run into people who, once they argue themselves into doing what they want to do, they insist that it's right, as opposed to saying, something says this is wrong, and I did it anyway. Even though you place yourself classically in what we call sin, there's something very healthy about knowing that you've done the wrong thing, and now you want to move in a more healthy sort of direction.
Yes, and that's I think one of the roles of conscience that's very helpful to us. So we've got this general story of Jesus. We've got the Bible helps us by setting a large framework and a context for us, right? And you've isolated for us the category of story, which is very helpful in parsing all that out. Now we would move to the second category, in my mind at least, that you raised before, and that is there are also sort of injunctions or general directions, principles that the Scriptures give us. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Those are hard to get to at times, simply because the first century world or the second century or 2 millennia before Jesus, that's not our world. It's not the place that we operate. And we tend to read the book and take the words to mean exactly what we would think they would mean today. Reading the Bible is often very difficult, and I seldom attack the book without some help, simply because
and commentaries and so on.
Absolutely, I'm not a scripture scholar. That's not my primary area, and friends that are, they've got more books than I do. There's just a need to get in to see what the text says, and especially when we look at moral matters, people like to fall back on the 10 Commandments. It's kind of a bare bones bit of business. The 10 Commandments, in their original meaning, growing up Catholic, the 5th commandment said, well, thou shalt not kill. Well, not just you shouldn't kill, but people began to raise questions about smoking and drinking and eating wrong kinds of things and not getting enough exercise, when the commandment originally meant you're not supposed to kill another Israelite, at least from what the scripture scholars tell me. Now, some Hittite or somebody else from some other tribe, that might be okay because we have to kind of duke it out sometimes. But don't ever kill any other Israelites. We've tended to take those commandments and so expand them, and what we've really done is put meaning into them that really wasn't there originally.
In terms of our own culture. So we have a raised consciousness on the question of capital punishment, for example, and at least at one theoretical level, the possibility of reforming people. And so there's some people say, well, therefore you shouldn't kill people even who have committed serious crimes or murders. You shouldn't do that because the Bible says thou shalt not kill. And we've now applied that and said, well, in fact, the bishops of the United States have been taking that position on capital punishment. It's a more refined notion, but it comes not just from reading the 5th commandment, thou shalt not kill, but it comes from a lot of other developments in our culture.
The text that comes to mind in that area is, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And, of course, that text, again, originally, if you get back to it, it means it's to limit how much retribution you bring to bear against somebody, so that you can't do any more, because the Bible recognizes that doing those sorts of things to people is bad. It's not helpful. It's hurtful.
Now, we got some other clear injunctions that Jesus seems to give us. He says, for example, you're supposed to love your neighbor and even love your enemies. Forgive those people. Now, that's, I think very often a very helpful thing. I mean, you got people arguing, neighbors who are arguing, spouses who are arguing, and you could read the scriptures, and in there Jesus is saying, be ready to forgive. Forgive those who have done wrong to you. Even if you can prove it was their fault, don't get hung up on that. Be the reconciling person. Reach out. Now, there's an injunction I think that maybe we could use well at any given time.
I think, too, that Jesus' moral injunctions rest upon a prior religious sort of injunction, and I think that's important, because Jesus' command to us to go out was to go out and evangelize, to gospelize, not moralize people, but to gospelize them. And preachers too often tend to jump from that gospel level to the moral level immediately. And in so doing, they lose the power, I think, of the gospel, because the gospel says, repent and believe the good news. And that change in heart is what then begins to exhibit itself in behaviors. When I taught high school some years ago, I found it to be not useful at all to spend a lot of time on rules immediately with these young women that I taught, but rather to help them get in touch with their best selves. That is to say, there's something inside that says, I want to do good stuff. I want to be good. I want to be healthy, and I want to help other people to be healthy. And out of that grow these injunctions. And once people get a hold of that, then to say, love your neighbor the way that you love yourself, that all of a sudden throws a lot of light, because it points them toward what the good is.
When you take the love injunction of Jesus, it really ends up being more than a law. We talk about the law of love that he's given us, but it doesn't function like a law like drive 55, and if you drive under 55, you've kept the law. As my mentor, Karl Rahner, liked to say, love is true to itself only if it's prepared to give more tomorrow than today. In other words, it's always an expanding thing. So when you talk about Jesus giving us this injunction, love God and love neighbor, there's a demand in that, a call, but it's not one that you can fulfill and then rest easily and say, well, I've arrived and here I am, God, I'm as perfect as I'm going to be. It seems like it's always calling us to do more. And that really, that creates an ethic of generosity rather than an ethic that just says, well, what's the minimum I can get by with?
It flows from inside of you. It's again, back to the Bible story, it's this new heart to be created in the individual, and it's not something that stands outside and beats on you the way a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit sign, there's a state trooper around the next bend. It's something inside that transforms all of your activities, and they take on new moral meanings because of the choice that you've made to believe Jesus is good news.
What about one of the other points you made, Jeff, that when you start looking at these biblical injunctions or invitations to growth and so on, it has to do with values, doesn't it? It has to do with how we value particular people, situations, our calling, and so on.
Laws are always second-order things. When I'm teaching, I draw a terrible looking flower on the board, and I label that laws, and then underneath that, under the ground, are these roots. It says values next to those. The flower above says, there's something important buried here. I want you to pay attention to it, because if you espouse these values and protect them, human life is better, and life is good. It helps people. People grow and get healthy. If you abuse these values, things tend to get worse. That's the way life is on the planet.
And so values become, crucial to this whole moral decision-making, don't they? That's what we're trying to do is try to become better people and more virtuous people, carry deep values within us. Then they will sort of dictate or guide the decisions we make in any given situation.
I keep thinking of this again in terms of the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
This is an economic decision that somebody has made, that the injustice that's going on there in Kuwait and the possible threat of Saddam Hussein is so great that it's worth X number of lives and X amount of property. That's a very difficult equation to make, but I mean that's essentially what's happening here. Somebody is trying to take those values and balance them against each other, and then the question is, well, how many lives and how much property becomes too great?
Well, Jeff, we've been talking here about moral decision-making. We raised the Persian Gulf to begin with, and you've come back to it. It tells us one thing, that issues are complex. There's no easy solutions, and people of goodwill are often on different sides of the question. And then we looked at the Scriptures. I mean, how do they help us in moral decision-making? Is it just that they have nothing to say? They don't give a clear answer, but they help us, and they give us a large story to live out. They give us the example of Jesus, his parables, the way he handled situations and so on. And also from the Scriptures then we get certain imperatives or injunctions like love God and love your neighbor, all of which help to form our values. And in that way I think the Scriptures are indeed an invaluable help to us in making moral decisions.